Hello again from Panaji in the Indian state of Goa. If you saw my last video here, you know that this city is famous as a former colonial capital of Portuguese India. But the original territorial capital, named Goa, was about 10 kilometers from here. It grew from a tiny settlement in the early 1500s to become a great city. Then in the 1700s, after an outbreak of cholera and malaria, it was completely abandoned. What's there today is a World Heritage Site that's one of the world's most unusual ghost towns. And that's where we're headed.
Old Goa is like no ghost town you'd ever expect to see. There are no standing remains of homes and businesses where 200,000 people once lived. Instead, there are Roman Catholic churches and monasteries, more than a dozen of them, once surrounded by a great urban zone that now tower above a steamy countryside, an architectural graveyard in the middle of nowhere.
This was ground zero for the vast colonial empire the Portuguese set up in India in the early 1500s to exploit the spice trade after Vasco da Gama's discovery of a long dreamed about trade route connecting Europe with India. It was a conquest not only for the Portuguese crown but for the Roman Catholic Church, most all of whose religious orders went to work here, both to service the Europeans who came and, more importantly, to convert the natives. 2 centuries later, the place you're looking at had grown to become a thriving center of politics and commerce under Portuguese control, and with a population that surpassed that of London, which gets us to what's so unusual about this place. If this were a ghost town of the American West, you'd likely see little left of wooden churches, saloons, and storefronts after 200 years of abandonment. But cut stone doesn't crumble easily. The most durable remnants of the great city that existed here, an impressive slew of Roman Catholic churches and monasteries, more than a dozen in all, stand as lonely oddities to a civilization that came and went. The old church you see, however unlikely it may seem, is Cathedral, which among these relic buildings, technically at least, continues to function as the seat of the Archdiocese of Goa and Damon. This cathedral began to be built in 1542 on the remains of an older, smaller church, although it wasn't finished until 1619. There were 2 towers. One of them collapsed in 1776. The church was built to commemorate the victory of the Portuguese here in 1510 over the Muslim kingdom of Bijapur, whose capital here the Portuguese destroyed. The victory happened to be on the feast day of St. Catherine, so the cathedral was named for her, with the word "se," meaning sea in Portuguese, attached in front of it. Over time, it's largely come to be referred to as merely the Se Cathedral.
You may already be wondering why I haven't shown you inside this cathedral. That's because, unfortunately, interior photography is forbidden here.
One of the few non-religious structures that still exist here is this one. It's the so-called Arch of the Viceroys, erected as a kind of ornate riverside entrance in 1599. The Viceroy at the time was one Francisco da Gama, the grandson of Vasco da Gama. Had you come here as recently as 70 years ago, you would have seen this arch crumble to the verge of falling down. It was restored in 1954. So far, it seems to have held up. The arch is about 300 meters from the river's edge, so I'm going to walk down to the edge and take a look at what's there. It's a still functioning ferry here, since there is no bridge for several miles. Well, that's one way to get across the river. It's almost tempting, except I don't know what the schedule is, so I don't know when I would get back. So if you think about it, 2.5 centuries ago, beyond, this would be pretty much the exact spot where the Portuguese landed here to attack the existing Muslim kingdom. And thereafter, until the place was abandoned, it was the entrepot for Portuguese India, right here on what's today a very lonely ferry dock. The Portuguese didn't just build a city here from scratch, they destroyed a city that already existed. If you recall my last video from Panaji, I showed you the former summer palace of Adil Shah, the ruler of the former Muslim kingdom of Bijapur. Well, this was Bijapur, the eponymous capital of that Muslim kingdom. The Portuguese left little traces of it behind. I'm walking up to one of those traces, what's left of the grand palace of Adil Shah. Not a summer palace, but the real deal, said to have been splendid and spacious in its day. The palace itself is gone. What remains is a basalt slab that was the grand entrance. It isn't legend about how splendid this palace once was. The Portuguese themselves reported it. In fact, the early viceroys made use of the palace as their official residence. The gate itself may not look like much, but I guess from the standpoint of a civilization that's been all but forgotten, is at least something. Even more dramatic than the conquering of this place was its sudden abandonment 200 years later, considering as how it had grown to be so enormous for its day. There wasn't a single outbreak of infection that caused this city to empty. Rather, it was a wave of outbreaks believed to have included a revival of the Black Plague, as well as pandemics of cholera and malaria. By 1769, the Viceroy moved to today's Panaji. This place continued to be the capital of Portuguese India in name only until Panaji's role as the new capital became official in 1843. By 1775, the great city that once stood here was reduced to only 1,500 people. Well, I'm inside the church of St. Cajetan. There's a sign that says no photography with a tripod and no videography, but the kind lady watching over this place, alone I might add, said, "Go ahead." So I am until I'm told otherwise. This church was built in 1661, as you can see from the exteriors, to the Corinthian style, but it was built on the model of St. Peter Church in Rome, and so it's very Italianate in some of its finishings. This is merely a, I hate to use the word, but run-of-the-mill church for this campus, this ghost town, former great city in India, because there are more than a dozen such churches and convents here. This is just another one of them, not anything exceptionally special, although it would be in almost any other circumstance. But just take a look at this place. someone else finally walked in. I think it's a couple of people who just happen to be friends of the docent. But quite a remarkable place. Thank you.
Welcome.
So many people come here and go to the two most famous of the churches here, including the cathedral, and others are lightly visited, to say the least, this being among them, but extremely impressive and somehow more meaningful when you come to a place like this and have it almost all to yourself. It is a ghost town, a ghost city, and yet it's almost devoid of anything that would suggest that a city was here except for these dozen or so great places of worship. I think the analogy would be akin to, well, comparing a whole lot of jet planes parked in the desert. It's strange to see them there. It's not their natural habitat. It's totally alien. And yet we know there's a reason that out-of-commission jets are sent to dry desert places. In this case, what you have are churches that are the equal to many of the churches you would expect to see in Europe or Latin America of the Roman Catholic faith. They're here in the middle of nowhere. They're parked in place, just like an airplane would be, except that the environment around them has changed from that of an urban environment of 250 years plus ago to a park-like environment, which is partly overgrown in small areas, but for the most part is rather well kept. There are palm trees and groves of other shade trees, and there are streets within this World Heritage Site that are meant to get people from point A to B, but they don't support any real commercial activity except for little fruit stands. No, thank you, not at the moment. Except like fruit sellers and small merchants who've put up stands. But it's just very weird because the places the churches are places that they always were, but they were surrounded by blocks of houses and merchants, all the things that you might expect in an 18th century, 17th century city. With a population of more than 200,000 at its peak, Goa, Old Goa, was on an even plane with the great cities of Europe at the time in terms of its size and impact. It was certainly in the first rank of cities sponsored by colonizers in any part of the world. The Assisi Church and Convent was among the first of the churches built in this former city, having been established by 8 Franciscan friars who arrived in Goa in 1517, although it was several decades before the church was actually completed. The complex here, including the additional building built beside it, is now the Historical Museum of Old Goa. Well, I really hate to tell you this, although I'm going to do it anyway, that the church, St. Francis de Assisi, which I can't show you because of the no photography rule, is really sensational inside. It's just that it's not being used as a church, so there are no pews, but it looks like a real historic artifact in there. And again, such a shame. No can show. One of the things about this place that I should mention of course, it's the openness of it, which is nice. It's almost like a park-like setting. It is also a bit windy and very hot. This is a humid part of India, as I think I've mentioned, and you don't stay out in the sun very long without really feeling it. Found a little lane that I thought I would walk down simply because it looks pleasant and it's in the shade. Some school children just approached me. I didn't get out the video camera. They started to talk to me, and then they seemed very nice. Elementary school children. They were well dressed. They had backpacks. But one of the little boys asked me for money, and before I could respond to him, there was a lady just over a nearby wall who was observing the whole thing, and she began to scold the little boy and explain to him that he shouldn't be doing that. She later told me that the children were from another region of India, that they were not Goans, and she personally felt affronted and embarrassed that anyone would be begging in Goa. I find that sort of a common reaction, not necessarily to the idea of begging, but to most things. I've met a number of Goans who talk about their region, their state, with a distinct pride and differentiate it in a positive way from the rest of India in their minds. I'm sure this kind of regionalism exists in many places in India as it does around the world, but it's very common here. Goans tend to be proud of Goa. One of my regrets here is not being able to take photos or videos inside these lofty churches. Not surprising to me, however. That's just part of India. These sorts of places, like any antiquity sites, are run by India's Department of Archaeology, I think it's called. And it is notoriously strict, some would say heavy-handed, in the way it permits access by tourists. Even at places like the Taj Mahal, tourists are often hounded about taking pictures. You wouldn't know it from the countless number of videos from Taj Mahal on YouTube, including my own, but it's a hassle to even work there. And that is the case in other places of historical importance in this country. They just sort of throw down these rules. It doesn't really foster tourism. But anyway, that's my mini rant for the day. I'm going to take you to another church, a very special one. Of all of Old Goa's churches and monasteries, none is more celebrated than this one, the Basilica of Bom Jesus, or in English, the Basilica of Good Jesus. It was begun to be built in 1594. The fact that Pope Pius XII elevated this Jesuit church in an Indian ghost town to the status of basilica in 1947 hints at the significance Catholics attach to this building and why it's a place of pilgrimage. That's because interred inside is the body of the Spanish cleric Francis Xavier, who with his friend Ignatius of Loyola and 4 others founded the Jesuit order, or as it's formally known, the Society of Jesus, in 1540. Saint Francis, he was canonized in the early 17th century, worked extensively to proselytize in Portuguese India, although he isn't necessarily remembered fondly among non-Catholics in India, since he once proposed to the Pope a Goan Inquisition to move his work along. The idea did not get green-lighted. Francis died on an island in the South China Sea in 1542, en route to the Chinese mainland on yet another church mission. His body was brought back to Malacca in Malaysia for a bit before being ultimately returned here. If you're wondering by this point why I'm telling you this from outside the basilica, it's of course the same reason I've mentioned before. No photography of any kind is allowed inside. Well, I've gone through and entered an inner garden where I've taken out my video camera, obviously. The basilica is impressive. Really, the tomb that people come to see. The line forms. People are slowed by the line. It took about 7 minutes to get from the front of the basilica, the back of it, up to the front where the tomb is. The body of the saint, it's encased in a silver coffin, but it's taken out for public viewing once every 10 years. And it just so happens that the last one of those public viewings was in December 2024. There are several tourist sites online, including ones that should know better, that claim the Basilica of Bom Jesus is the oldest church in Goa. It isn't. The oldest still standing is the Church of Our Lady of the Rosary, built between 1544 and 1547. It's said that Portuguese commander Alfonso de Albuquerque ordered the church to be built on the spot he was standing when he received word that soldiers had completed the conquest of Goa in 1510. It's on a hilltop and a little difficult to get to, especially in this heat. In other words, it's a hill I'm not willing to die on. Well, this marks the end of this series of videos from southern India. Tomorrow I fly to Mumbai, where I'll depart for Bangkok, and after a layover, head to my next destination, Cambodia. As always, thanks for subscribing and liking the videos. I invite you to follow me on Instagram. So see you from Cambodia. Until then, ciao and peace.